Perspectives, Edmentum's virtual event series where we gather educators and leaders from across the country to talk about the topics that are top of mind for all of you right now. Today, we're going to talk about the future of quality virtual learning. There's little doubt that virtual learning will play a prominent role in the future of education. What is less clear is what that role is and what we need to make sure is essential for its success. Edmentum recently commissioned whiteboard advisors to explore the virtual learning landscape in depth through a white paper called A Human-Centered Approach to Quality Virtual Learning. And I am super excited to welcome three people that contributed to that white paper. And they're going to tell us a little bit more in just a few minutes. To start, my name is Jason Mitchell, and I will be your host today. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy Leadership here at Edmentum. And our team helps to identify innovative educators, promising practices, and we give those leaders a platform to share strategies, their insights, their expertise, and even some practical tips. All right, so as we get started, I want to set some expectations and norms today. I wanted to briefly call a few items to your attention about this particular event platform. We hope that you'll engage with us using the chat. There are channels to introduce yourself. You can share your thoughts alongside the panelist. And there's even a channel to ask the speakers different questions. You can also share emoji responses, which is my personal favorite. And we'll get to those part a little later on today. We're also going to have polls throughout today's session. And the polls channel will contain links throughout the presentation. So click there so we can see your feedback and your perspective in real time. We'll also chat in a brief post-event survey at the end of the event. All right, you ready? Let's get to it. So we are delighted to have this really phenomenal panel with us today. They bring deep expertise and perspectives on how virtual learning plays a critical role in equity within our school communities. So as we begin, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to just give the audience a little bit of a background, context, the lens that you look through, the role that you play, and even the passion, like what fuels that commitment to education. So first, we've got Tamiko Hatcher, and Tamiko is the Director of Specialty Programs for Akron Public Schools in Ohio. So Tamiko, tell us a little bit about your role there and the kind of programs that you're working on.
Hi, again, Tamiko Hatcher, Akron Public Schools. We service right around 20,000 students in an urban setting. And we always have to respond to the changing landscape of students being connected to education in a very diverse opportunities to serve. We're currently working on year 2 of our 100% online school that was birthed post-COVID. It's currently serving right around 3% of our student body. And then we're also looking to expand into areas to provide personalized education for students who are not either electing to seek education in a traditional brick and mortar school. So we're looking at innovative ways in which we can continue to serve students in a very equitable way, utilizing every piece of digital content that's out there.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us, Tamiko. And thanks for being willing to share your expertise and your perspective today. Next up, we've got Dr. Beth Rabbit, who serves as the CEO of the Learning Accelerator. Beth, so for those of you in the audience who may not be familiar with Learning Accelerator, can you just tell us a little bit about your organization and maybe what drives your passion towards this project?
Absolutely. So thank you for having me. The Learning Accelerator is a national nonprofit that believes every child should have the effective, engaging, and equitable education they need to reach their full and unique potential. So what that means for us is learning that's personalized to who they are, their unique strengths, needs, context, community, learning that's focused on mastery rather than the process of schooling, and learning that's holistically developing, because the science tells us that kids just develop in academics alone. Our organization believes that this vision is held by many and that there's tremendous work underway across the country to make it a reality in practice, from the level of the student to the educator, all the way up to the policymaker and funder. But oftentimes, the learning that's happened and the resources that are getting produced by all that energy get stuck. They're fragmented, siloed, disconnected, or not openly available. So our organization works across the country to learn from educators, to surface great strategies that they're developing, to learn about the collective challenges they're experiencing. We build networks that bring people together around shared problems, and then we do a ton of open dissemination because we believe the knowledge to improve public education is a public good. I will say personally, I come to this work having been a highly mobile student who had to move a lot with a learning difference. I'm the mom of 2 elementary aged kids who have been in public school through the course of the pandemic and are returned now. And we just deeply believe at TLA that we need to bring every resource to the table to give kids what they need, depending on like who they are and their context and experiences. And virtual learning is one of those tools, and we're pretty passionate about how to make it as high a quality as possible so that it's available to any learner who needs it and any district in the country.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that both personal and professional perspective. It's what drives us all, right? So finally up, we have Dr. Deandre Weaver, who's the Chief Digital Equity Officer for Digital Promise. Welcome, Deandre. So for those of you
Jason,
who aren't
how's it
familiar
going?
with
It's good to
Digital
see you and
Promise,
be here.
great. It's good to see you too. So so tell us a little bit about you, Digital Promise. Like, what is it that's going on out there from your perspective?
Yeah. Thanks again for having me. And I'll start off by talking about Digital Promise, and then I'll talk a little bit about me and why I'm just so passionate about the work that we're doing here. But Digital Promise has been around for 11 years now. It was initially authorized by Congress under the H.W. Bush administration. It was launched under the Obama administration, and it's a nonpartisan international nonprofit tasked with shaping the future of learning and advancing equitable education systems by bringing together research, technology, and our substantial network of practitioners. So what does that mean? We have multiple networks of practitioners, superintendents, teachers, and we bring them together to advance education in the U.S. that leverages technology and learning sciences research and what's good and what's on the forefront of education to achieve our big strategic goals. And we have 3 very, very, very big strategic goals. The first is that we want 75% of historically and systematically excluded students in America. We want them learning in education systems with the knowledge and tools to create the conditions for them to exceed. We also want 30 million historically and systematically excluded students to have sustained and meaningful experiences in something that we call powerful learning. I'm looking forward to talking about that a little later today, with the goal of putting them on a path to post-secondary completion. And then we also want 30 million historically and systematically excluded students enabled to achieve post-secondary credentials that offer economic security, well-being, and agency. So all of our work is really centered around helping all students, but specifically historically and systematically excluded students, achieve goals that aren't necessarily possible in our current system. And I think those goals really drove me to this organization as the first Chief Digital Equity Officer at Digital Promise. I'm a former superintendent and community superintendent and principal and teacher. But the role and the work that I get a chance to do here is really around advancing powerful learning across schools and districts across the U.S. by really advocating and solving for inequities in broadband access, the inequitable distribution and use of powerful technology in schools, and also by creating initiatives, establishing partnerships, and influencing policy at the state and federal levels to address what we call at Digital Promise, the digital learning gap. And we want to do that at scale. And very specifically, I support Verizon Innovative Learning Schools, which is this crazily innovative partnership with Verizon that provides over 500 Title I middle schools and high schools across the U.S. with devices and connection to their LTE network and professional learning for teachers. So really excited to share a little bit more about our work today.
Yeah, well, fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. And I'm just super excited about the experience that you bring, the perspectives that you have. I wanted to start off and take a quick poll from our audience and see the perspective that they bring to the table. So there's that link for the poll. And if you'll select which response best reflects your level of agreement with the following statement: our school community is demanding that virtual learning be an integral part of the evolution of learning for our students. So when you look at that question, do you strongly agree with it? Do you agree with it? Maybe disagree, or maybe strongly disagree? I'll give you all a few minutes to think about that and put in your vote. While we're on that, I want to talk about a topic that's tangential to it. So we all experienced this pandemic, and we saw that sort of accelerated awareness and this adoption of new terms in education at this really, really fast pace. And our lack of this sort of unified language and common understanding around terms such as virtual learning, blended learning, hybrid, remote, distance learning, I heard it called 1,000 different things. It makes the conversation really confusing. So I wanted to start our conversation by talking about how we define and refine the understanding of virtual learning so that we can have a clear conversation and make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So first, let's take a look at those poll results. All right, so as far as strongly agree, it looks like 25% strongly agree, 75% agree. Almost nobody, well, actually nobody disagrees on that. So panelists, any surprises on these responses here?
Not at all.
No, not me either. Well, we'll tell you what.
Actually, yeah, it is surprising a little bit to me because there are many school districts that are not necessarily demanding that virtual learning be a part. There are many school districts that are looking to go back to what it was like before the pandemic and without using virtual learning. So this is actually a bit surprising for me.
Yeah, it's we see regionally differences in perspectives on that, and there's a definite difference in that. So all right, let's think about this from a couple different perspectives. Deandre, let me start with you. So at Digital Promise, you all have taken some steps to develop common language around methodologies for delivering digital curriculum. Talk a little about that development and what type of common languages you all use at Digital Promise.
Yeah, and I actually like to talk of it, if you don't mind, from a slightly different perspective and how we define powerful learning. And I think that's, one way that's really top of mind for us right now is defining these sets of principles that educators can use to design learning experiences that really engage students' hearts and their minds and thinks and considers a more whole child approach. And we define learn as being personal and accessible, which means that it's really specific to the student in every single way possible. We think of it in terms of learner variability and whatever the tools, the experiences that teachers or learning facilitators need in order to make sure that the student is very present in the learning experience, that his or her or their needs are met every single way. And so we're thinking about it from that standpoint, that it's also authentic and challenging, that it's based in something that's real, and that it's appropriately rigorous for every single student, no matter where they are in the learning continuum. It's also collaborative and connected for us. We believe that learn doesn't happen in isolation, right? And so we think those powerful learning experiences ensure that students are able to work with others, not just their peers, but other experts inside and outside of the walls of school. And that it's inquisitive and reflective, that it requires, metacognition. It requires students to think and ask the questions and to learn from that standpoint. And we believe those are important aspects, and the medium, the way that students access that, whether that's in school or remotely or utilizing other pathways, we're pretty open to variations there. We are just advocating for the types of learning experiences that deeply engage students and that uses technology in a way that makes it ubiquitous, that allows for learning to happen anytime, any place.
Yeah, it was interesting. I just had a conversation with the chief academic officer of New York City Schools, and his response was like, this isn't a binary choice. It's not one or the other. This is just teaching and learning, and it's not digital or it's not paper. It's teaching and learning, and I thought that was just a very succinct way of saying, that we're just talking about teaching and learning. So thank you for sharing your perspective on that. Tamiko, you have a little bit different perspective, so Deandre is looking at it, policy, advocacy, sort of national perspective. You have a district and a practitioner's perspective. So how do you bring that type of consistent language and shared definitions to your organization?
Yeah, and I think that the groundwork that Dr. Weaver had mentioned is what all good systems will embody. I'm just
Yeah.
at the end of it that now has to move those systems and those beliefs to true application and communicating that to the students and families. What's interesting is that prior to COVID, we had always offered an option for students and families to take advantage of digital curriculum or content or online schooling. And then once the pandemic hit, and let me back up a little bit, and during those time periods, it was always this thing you did off the grid for a very targeted group of people, that kind of this double secret way of educating students. And then, you get some wind in your sail when you start looking at higher ed, looking at different delivery systems. And could you
Uh-huh.
really deliver high quality levels of engagement, true rigor, opportunities to learn? How do you apply it? And can you really create an authentic way of bouncing back ideas in this virtual world, which is really the foundation of good learning and that experience? So in public ed, I have the wonderful privilege of looking at innovative systems from the development of a STEM school or an early college or a school of arts. And in my portfolio, you have our online school. And I'm smiling saying, it's easy
Yeah.
for us to make a connection when you build a traditional brick and mortar school based on those tenets that Dr. Weaver had mentioned. But yet, when you go to virtual, it was, well, how can I continue to keep the minimal educational commitment to our families, which is all kids have a right to public education? So how do I just keep it going? Not necessarily how do we ensure that the quality of that experience continues to produce the type of graduates that we all aspire to produce. So that's a different threshold. So in that came some unlearning to relearn, but then everyone during the COVID process, everyone then had to rethink what they thought about virtual or digital learning, because what it essentially happened was you no longer could have the students in your seat in front of you. And now we had to wrestle with education and what does it really mean and how do you create an authentic experience? So I bring it back to what Dr. Weir had mentioned, whether it's a policy standpoint or a belief system, is that education, if we couldn't find a way to educate students who didn't walk through our door, it was game over for us. Like,
Hmm.
and very few people experience layoffs, even when we couldn't transport students across the United States. So it was one of those Darwin experiences that we've seen. And you say, well, if we don't find a way to evolve, and not just to deliver education as a whole, but really to ensure that it develops the type of graduates that we all want and that society will demand later on. So for us, we did get some help in the policy realm, because our policymakers really wanted to look at what did we do in the past as we talked about educating students in an online environment. And we were forced to place those students in a place where you could actually regulate, you could ensure the success. So it almost created another group for that were considered a vulnerable population. How will we ensure that they are not excluded? How will we make sure that the amount of funds that we would allocate to a group of students was going to equate to high levels of educational output? So from that aspect, we really had to get serious about what did it mean to deliver high quality learning experiences for students, and what were we willing to commit to ensure that that happens when students don't always get off of a bus and walk into our pearly white gates. So those were all the elements of us establishing, or that was the basis for us establishing, what is it that we really aspire to do? Is it virtual? Is it digital? Is it blended? And what are all those iterations? And why is it so important for us to be able to communicate to our families so that they can make an informed choice as what's going to allow their child to, or their scholar, to be their best? And that messaging and branding was the basis for how and why we needed to evolve and really shore up our messaging.
Yeah, it's so remarkable. I mean, you think about all of that and all of that complexity in a really challenging environment. But at the end of the day, it's the kids that are either in our classrooms or on the other side of that screen that we're trying to
Mhm.
support in that. You made a really interesting point that there's such a difference between high quality virtual learning and emergency remote learning, which is what we experienced in the pandemic. And I think that the organization who's very well poised to sort of talk about that is Beth at the Learning Accelerator. So you all sort of define virtual learning as an experience where online modalities mediate a student's interactions with learning content and their teacher. And that's it's succinct, but there's a lot in there. Can you sort of like this definition and just talk a little bit about how you came up with this and what some of the meanings are behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. So working at the national level, we've, as probably Deandre knows, there's a swirl of terminology, not just of words we're using now, but words we used in the pandemic, words we're talking about the future. What we tend to find in our language is, one, we fail to center the learner and their experience as much as we should. Oftentimes our language, for example, such as learning loss, talk about a system expectation and how the system is organizing, not about the actual experience of learners that kids have and how those might be different. And so when we're trying to come at definitions that help us do our research and work with others, we really try to think about what is different for the learner. How do we get at the core, the instructional core, and define from there? So the definition that you just shared really is about getting at that core, so that we can have real conversations about the different models and tools and approaches we might use in that interaction, as well as candidly quality. We do actually have some great examples of poor implementations of strategic virtual learning in our very recent history. And so it's important for us who are advocating for virtual learning as a tool to acknowledge that and to be able to talk about what might be different in practice or supports for students that we want to pursue now. Because while good, I am absolute agreement around the importance of powerful learning experiences and that good learning and teaching is good learning and teaching, we can also talk about how virtual learning, we know from the research, is slightly different. Kids are farther away from their teachers. They're interacting with each other and teachers through a means they might not actually have a ton of experience in. Oftentimes there's significantly more self-direction that is needed, and kids need a lot more personalization and connection to community to be able to persist on their own. And so if we look at those challenges, and then we also look at the opportunities and the different ways we can work, we'd have much clearer conversations as a community about where we are, where we want to go in ways that aren't precious. Our field loves to sometimes label on qualifiers to our definitions. Well, personalization is a powerful experience where kids get formative, when we go on, but the reality is like those qualifications, and when we don't have successful implementations, we talk about, well, that wasn't what we meant, isn't helpful to us as a field. And so we've done a lot of work to try to define.
Yeah, well, I think a term that I heard a lot during the pandemic was fail forward. And I think that's what we really have the opportunity to do, because there was a whole lot of experimentation during the pandemic, and there were some really great bright spots out there. So thank you all for sort of setting that common ground, common language. I want to dig in a little bit deeper and check in with our audience and see which response sort of best reflects their levels of agreement with the following statement. So, an unprecedented disruption in learning has laid bare the issues that schools can no longer ignore. So in my district and school, we are actively embracing new solutions to systemic challenges in education. So do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? So I'm curious to see how this one plays out as opposed to that last question that we asked. While people are filling out that particular poll, let's talk a little bit more about what's in the white paper. And you all contributed to this this body of work. The title is A Human-Centered Approach to Quality Virtual Learning, and the foreword was written by Bill Hite. He's the president and CEO of Knowledge Works. And he made a really interesting statement in that foreword. And he said, it's perhaps natural to shun tools like remote learning and other technologies that got us through the pandemic, but also really remind us of that difficult time. And he says, however, if we're being honest, normal wasn't working for a lot of students before the pandemic. That sort of familiar classroom experience was struggling to equip students with the skills required to keep pace with demands of a rapidly changing economy. Now that's super interesting because it was thinking about like, do we want to go back to what we were doing? Because for a lot of kids, it didn't actually work out there. So I think few people would probably disagree that we need a new vision moving forward. And that's sort of what I was alluding to, fail forward piece. Okay, so let's look at the quiz questions and the audience response. Now there's a pretty equal distribution there. So in essence is your district or school actively embracing new solutions to systemic challenges in education? So equal distribution. Let's see, panelists, any surprises in that, or is that in line with what you thought?
For us, I think this is reflective of what we're seeing. I think in particular where places people might be disagreeing or strongly disagreeing, something we're acknowledging is just the intense pressure that school systems are facing, that around recovery and reemergence, that oftentimes mean folks are sort of snapping back to try to get good at what we were trying to do before, rather than looking at the set of new tools and resources that we might have developed that could actually take us further, and really connecting the work we're doing in the now to more transformative goals rather than just like the urgency.
Excellent. Any other insight onto that?
I think it's also a reflection of there's still a great deal of learning to be done about digital, virtual, online schooling and the role it plays in the larger ecosystem of education. So oftentimes it's met with a little bit of apprehensiveness as to how do I embrace this thing and what role does it play in the diversity of our school districts across the nation. So I would expect a varied approach to what role it plays from those who are saying, oh my gosh, we are now experiencing this new norm, and what role does it play? Or I told you it didn't work. My data says that it doesn't work in online, and was it the system or the process or poor implementation, or how did it impact me? And I still don't think that we've turned the corner on the role that virtual, digital, online learning means for the macro culture. So this kind of hits at the heart of that.
And it's hard.
I'll just add
Go
one
ahead.
quick thing too. I think it also just represents like the political climate that schools are in right now, with different approaches and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable based on, you know, what happened during the pandemic. And there are school systems where superintendents are looking to do more forward, you know, thinking work, and aren't able to because of pushback from, you know, different political agendas. So I think it's important also to mention that.
Yeah, you're definitely onto something in that. We definitely see that different pressures or different perspectives depending on where people are coming from. So we're talking about change and this sort of like fire hose of change that we're all drinking from. And I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about like, how do each of you prioritize those changes in education? When you think about the systems that you're supporting or working towards change, especially in service of meeting the needs of that whole learner, where do you start and what would you prioritize? Tamiko, let me start with you. I mean, you're a leader who's supporting practitioners in the district, and you've identified several top initiatives for change that would support yours. Where do you start?
I under the direction of our superintendent, our start was a belief that we have to be broad enough and vast enough to serve our 20,000 diverse students. So in doing so is how can they access education in a way that they felt safe, comfortable, and that could deliver high quality outputs. So that was the charge going in. So there was never a thought or a question as to whether or not online or virtual schools was going to exist here in Akron. The question more so was how were we going to provide an equitable access, and how would we create the learning environment that not only bridged the gap between where we thought it could potentially go and where families were at this current stage of accessing it once they just been kind of bathed in what it what it meant during our desperate time of COVID. So for us, it was a focus on creating a sense of consistency and stability, knowing that students would be accessing their learning from their home, recognizing that 98% of our students are free and reduced lunch, ensuring that they had the resources to stay on the whatever digital platform and stay connected in their virtual world. The other part of it is that we've made a commitment to what we believe education should entail, whether they are in it was built upon the premise that majority of our students would be walking through a door and we could access them and we can do these wonderful things. So what it forced us to do was say, are they no longer entitled to that experience just because for whatever reason families have decided to access their education from any remote location across, this or our what I found from our boundary lines because we got into some policy things there. So once we wrestled with that element, then we started to look at it and say, irregardless of funding, we believe that students should still have experiential learning experiences. There were things that we would provide in a traditional brick and mortar that they are entitled to. So it became a different level of equity that extended beyond, do you have internet access, to are you really immersed in a learning experience, and how would a club or an organization look through a um, through a monitor versus how we do it, because education for us is not just the curriculum and content. It is the
Yeah.
experience that we want our students to take part in at every level of development. So it's that happy union between both of those. And our focus has been on how can we create that level of scaffolding, that level of experience, and then commit to being able to market as a non-negotiable to our families. So I think when we arrive, we can say these will be guaranteed experiences for your child, whether they walk through our doors or if they choose to access their learning at home. And that is pushing policy to think different. What is a school day? What
Hmm.
does our staff supports this kid? Are they accessible online? We are a district that have interventions and supports. Are they only available between my workday? Because remember, most public schools only have one shift.
Yeah.
So you look at many of those areas that's uncharted territory for our area of profession, and we have to grapple with that every time that we look at a negotiated agreement as to how do we define an educator today, and for students who push the envelope on how they are choosing to learn.
Boy,
So
that
those are
yeah, you just hit the nail on the head in so many different ways. One of that white paper talks about students' learning is accelerated and amplified when their social brain is engaged. And you used the word connection a lot, that engagement and connection, and just thinking through, like, it's complex, and but it's important that when we look at different modalities, that we address the needs of the learner. But how does the Learning Accelerator think about these sort of priorities in educational change, in policy and advocacy?
Hmm. So I think our vision for learning and for the systems that support learning are probably very aligned with others on this session. I think a unique role that we play at TLA is trying to make sense of the bigger picture of where are different organizations and entities and school districts in terms of their process towards that vision for powerful learning for kids, who's doing what, and what do we think the big challenges are that are facing us in this moment. Broadly speaking, our priorities then are defined by where we see the gaps that people are facing and where we see opportunity for collective movement and sharing. Within the context of recovery, we're thinking about two big priorities. The first is advancement. How do we take this moment as educators, as school system leaders, to think about moving forward towards more personalized and resilient models rather than retrenching in doing what we might have done before the pandemic. The simple reality is we are facing uncertain futures, whether it be navigating this pandemic, future challenges, climate change, changes in the workforce. And so it's up to us to build systems of schools that can be really resilient and build experiences that can help kids build their resiliency to be able to navigate that future with confidence and success. And so we're thinking a lot about how do we help leaders make choices to advance, to leverage the knowledge that exists. We think virtual learning is a really important tool, particularly as we think about future mobility of learners. The second thing that we're thinking a lot about is how do we acknowledge the progress and the learning that our systems did over the last 3 years as we were making our way through this pandemic project. I can talk about Hop, Skip, Leapfrog. We talked to 20 districts about what they'd done differently. And what we saw was that people had done a ton of learning about how to work in new ways, use new tools, reorganize resources. Unless we actually recognize that learning and point to what went well, we can't actually talk about how we're going to take those new skills and muscles and move forward in the future. A lot of our solutions may in fact exist in that work we just did if we're willing to recognize it. So we're doing a lot of help trying to help people recognize. And that's why we focused on virtual learning as one priority, because what we saw was massive investment in tools and resources and training for teachers. We saw a lot of kids and families say, this might not be what I want full-time, but this seems like a really helpful tool for me. So how do we help districts actually look at that and schools look at that and say, okay, how do we do this more strategically with a focus on equity and opportunity creation into the future? And that's the learning that we as a sector need to do right now.
Yeah, and I think about the immediate application of that. I mean, in Hurricane Ian that just hit Florida, there are 6 districts that are devastatingly impacted. And when we think about, okay, to Tamiko's point, like, where do we start in that recovery? I mean, we start with meeting their very basic needs as humans, but we need to move on and make sure that they feel connected to their school and community and family and support system. And then we need to engage the academic side of that equation. And to your point about how can we leverage what we just went through and apply them in situations, these sort of unexpected situations, I think we're probably more equipped now than we were in the past to deal with that. So that is just the exact application of what you're talking about. So Deandre, you look at it from a little bit different perspective. When we think about sort of the educational change from a district's perspective, and then you think about it from the learning accelerators perspective, how does it differ from the lens that you all look through at Digital Promise?
I don't think it differs at all, actually. I mean, I think we all are advocating for the same shifts that need to be made, the same retooling of an educational system that was not set up to support each and every learner and their uniqueness. I think we're all thinking about it from how do we use this moment of disruption to change and improve at scale. And I think we still have the same challenges where there is there's much more interest to go back, to retract, to not necessarily capitalize on new learnings or the learnings that came out of the pandemic, to go back to what we've done before, given the other crises that still exist in schools, i.e., staff shortage crises, the ability or the need to continue to advance learning. I think from a Digital Promise perspective, I mean, we are really focused on much more around like inclusive design. How are we making sure that that whoever is coming to the table to solve the problem, we are centering that around those that are most closest to the problem, those that are most impacted by the problem, are at the table to help design some of those solutions. We're thinking about it from the point of learner variability. How are we from the very beginning thinking about the unique needs of every single kid and designing learning experiences that result in that? We're thinking about it from a more competency-based model and a model that is going to advance more personalization. So I think, we don't see it differently at all. We see the same challenges, and I think our opportunity is working together to address them.
So I'm going to dig in on this topic a little bit more because quality virtual learning, it's much more than just sort of like the technology, and all of you have touched on that. So when we think about those core components of quality learning experience, it means that we establish meaningful relationships, that we provide effective instruction, that we look at quality curriculum, that we establish a culture of success for all students. What's interesting about these sort of tenets is that they're also true for a traditional classroom environment. I was just going to see from the speakers' perspectives, when you think about those core components of quality virtual learning, Beth, can a high quality virtual learning, does it act as a tool that can help create more equitable learning opportunities for students?
Yeah, high quality learning, virtual learning is not the point. It's a vehicle, right? For helping us solve problems that we experience for learners. At TLA, we orient around key learning questions. One of our key learning questions this year is how can high quality virtual learning drive greater equity and opportunity for students? When we talk about virtual learning, we're talking about learning that can happen in a classroom, can happen in a hybrid format, can happen outside of school. We've had hundreds of conversations. We've been trying to sort of map, like, what are the values that we could bring? If we were saying, hey, virtual learning is actually a tool for us to bring into systems to solve problems we have not been able to solve, to unlock new ways of working and new resources, to actually produce different outcomes than we have in the past. And as someone mentioned before, our outcomes have not been what we want. And so a couple of things we see virtual learning as an opportunity for. One, customizing support and acceleration for kids in a moment where we actually need that personalized, effective, targeted support more than ever. Access to small group tutoring, access to an online tool to practice. Another thing we see is access to experts and expertise. Someone was talking about the teacher shortage right now, which is extremely real. Why should kids be denied the opportunity to learn about a passion area or to have advanced coursework simply because we can't put an adult physically in the classroom with them? Shame on us if we let that be the reason for why kids can't access those resources. Also, passion-based experiences. Another thing is time flexibility. Time and people are our most precious resources in this work that we are doing. How can we actually use virtual learning to let kids work at different times, to free up time, for kids who might have a 2-hour commute to school in a rural area, actually learn from home a couple of days a week and get more time for learning. We also see opportunities for kids to engage in interests and passions, CTE, online internships. There's an amazing school in Dallas, Texas that's exploring hybrid approach using the metaverse to let kids do internships. And then finally, critical skill building. We are all as adults on this platform today because we've learned how to leverage virtual experiences to do work together. That is the future. Having digital literacy, self-direction, being able to use these tools, that really matters. And so we think it's super important for communities to identify their why in virtual learning. It might differ based on the kids and the students and potentially the teachers and families, but getting clear on the why show us which models are going to work and how for which kids under which circumstances.
Boy, that's a perfect transition to the question that I was going to ask Deandre, who I've heard you say this quote that says, like, the future of learning is hybrid and it's ubiquitous. It should be that kids can learn anytime, anywhere. So when you think about that vision for future learning, like, what does it look like for the student? What does it look like for the teacher from a more tactical perspective?
Yeah. I think, and when I say hybrid, I think of the reality that, like, students still, like, there is a need for some students to still come to school for an economic, purpose for our larger society, right? Parents need a place for some kids to go. And even in that regard, students don't necessarily have to go directly to a school to learn, and learning can happen anywhere. And so I think my point is around, like, how just learning in general has to improve in the following areas. One, it's around, like, clarity around what students should learn, but also flexibility on how it's learned and how learning is demonstrated. I think that still is the future of learning because we've not done that exceptionally well right now. I think it's also, like, credentialing learning that happens in a single form, from, like, what kids learn when they go out to the Smithsonian museums in DC with their families and caregivers, to, like, the real life learning that's happening on the streets of Chicago when kids are advocating for issues that are important to them. Like, those are real moments that kids have demonstrated and learned how do we credential that and place value in that, in those experiences? I think it's also students receiving credit for applying what they've learned in what work studies, apprenticeships, other volunteer related events, and also receiving compensation, monetary compensation for that. It's the relevancy around it, and it's also connected to our desire to ensure like more economic mobility and security. I think it's also, and I think Beth mentioned this earlier, but it's students engaging in passion-driven learning via OutSchool, for instance, or students taking courses that aren't available in their districts through, Step Mojo, for example. It's how we using technology to solve the problems that exist, and not allowing those to be barriers to providing what kids need. And then I think it's also just centering this idea that our systems and what adults do and what we do in our school districts are really in service of students genuinely. And if they are the unit of focus, then what are all the things that we need to change? What are all the flexibilities? How do we need to be agile in support of them? And that is definitely to my colleagues' point around time of day, when learning happens. Is it always between 8 and 3 or 7 and 2? Or can it be a lot, those hours be extended? Can teachers be available in the evening and not be available during the school day and have access to strong quality, even at times that's not necessarily consistent with what we've done before? I think it's also the ability for students to master content and skills and time not be a factor indicator. Just a challenge right now in public education. Teachers always feel stressed with trying to get through the curriculum. And what happens year in and year out is that so many students don't actually learn half of what teachers cover. So how do we give teachers the time and the flexibility, and also students the actual learning environment that will allow them to master content and skills, and not progress through the system without actually achieving that learning? And then finally, I think it's really about creating a system that allows for personalization for every single kid. And whatever that may be, without having to name that, it's just the flexibility and granting districts the autonomy to be flexible, and granting teachers the autonomy and instilling the mindset of that flexibility. I think that's what I hope for the future.
Yeah, that it's super interesting. I sort of see this progression. Like Beth started off talking at policy. Deandre took it to student and practitioner perspective. We got a question from the audience, and I'm going to encourage the audience to keep asking questions on this. But Tamiko, I thought that you might be poised to answer this because it's squarely within the purview of what you've done by creating this virtual program and evolving it over time. And the question is, what things that I can say to help my district see the benefits of virtual learning? And they have a bad perception based on the pandemic. I'm sure you had to deal with that square on. Any advice for our audience member?
I think it's recapping some of the items that were shared previously. One of them is recognizing that what we did during the pandemic was an emergency situation. So I don't believe that any of the implementation strategies were ones that was really deeply embedded in research and practice, but more on a timeline that we recognize the need to continue to educate our scholars, and we need to find a delivery system for that, and also work within confinements or constraints of whatever your negotiated agreement would allow. What we're talking about is a conversation that allows us to really create the basis of what we've heard Beth and Deandre say. How do we view educating students within our district in a way that is really puts them at the center and allow us to personalize education that meets their needs? And what are we willing to expand upon or push or break down to achieve that ultimate goal? So a large portion of it is that I don't know of any school, and maybe the two of other panelists can help me, that is able to meet 100% of their needs in any locale across the nation. So if in fact we get to 95%, what does those 5% need, and how do we deliver it? So if we're always aspiring to find ways in which we can continue to educate are even our most vulnerable, or even push our students who are able to have high levels of success? How do we provide them with more? The system itself will never evolve nor change to address all the future needs that we have. My push is that how can this particular resource aid us in achieving that goal? And if we're willing to really have and facilitate um, heartfelt discussions, that there are personnel around this nation who will really help facilitate those discussions. Because it is a mindset, it's a different way of thinking about education. It's, do you value the employee? Do you value the student? Do you value the political stakeholders? Everyone will put their label on what is right and what is wrong. But my big question is, for the one or two kids who you would add value and benefit, are they worth it? And if you don't want to wrestle with that fundamental question, that what may work for you or what may work for some may not work for all, then my push is then explore additional alternative options. Virtual, digital, online schooling isn't for everyone, and to
No.
me, that's the other element of it. But there are pieces and parts of it, and there is, as you've heard outlined today, some fundamental principles that will allow and should be the basis of any robust system. And if a community wants to challenge themselves to meet the needs of all of their students, I would welcome that opportunity to share in some of the lessons learned, the best practices that are out there, and obviously um, be an open book for many of the um, the lessons learned through the process. But make no mistake about it, for the one or two students that you're able to serve, for the families who you're able to provide options and opportunities during their time of crisis, if I didn't have this option available, I can tell you that I would have students and families disenfranchised, ones that I couldn't do a wellness check on, students and families who are dealing with just life events, that by providing this opportunity or resource and doing so in a way that not only values the academic connectivity, but it's also about ensuring that these kids have a cause, someone who's looking for them, whether or not if it's them to walk through a door or to um, log into a classroom or session. And in many cases, for us, transportation is a barrier. And Northeast Ohio, that poses some additional boundaries. So I think when I listen to Mr. Weaver talk about the role that education plays for families, whether it's funny, I remember saying to our executive team, I said, you recognize we are daycare, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Being able to send your child to school for a duration of time and to allow them to persist, we serve a function in this economic um, in our society. And when you take away that system, a lot of other businesses really found themselves trying to figure out what to do next. And then if you take our students here who post COVID were able to find themselves making 18, 19, $22 an hour at 17 and 18, for us, it posed a completely different value system on our students. And we're saying, how do I tell a child who may now be the single source of income in their family that, oh, I'm not willing to change my delivery system to
Right.
accommodate what I see as your pressing need? So
Right.
how do we value human life? How do we really look at that?
You raise a great point, and that's how I'm going to end today's session. So I have a sort of a call to action for our audience and our panelists as well. We've got 5 minutes left, so I was going to ask each of you 30 seconds. What's your silver lining? What's the takeaway from all that we've been through that you're like, yes, we came out of this better? So 30 seconds or less. I'll see. No, okay, all right, Beth. Would you go first? If Deandre's like, oh no, not those aren't me. Just 30 seconds or less. What excites you about this? Silver lining. Uh-oh. Oh, hold on. Mute.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'll take 25 seconds now. What I'm really excited about was the investment that Congress made into digital equity and the $65 billion to ensure that broadband is available to everyone, and also making sure that people have the skills that they need to actually access the opportunities that having a broadband connection and device can bring. And I think that's going to create a domino effect on many other systems, particularly public education, that I think is definitely warranted, given where we are with the use of technology and how so many of our daily applications require us to access the internet and access devices, and what that'll mean for how we think about learning for students and think about learning for teachers and pre-service teachers and leaders. So I think that's what I'm really excited about.
Fantastic. Beth, what excites you? What's your silver lining in 30 seconds or less?
Yeah, I just bring a deep optimism for the capacity of humans to learn. We are in a learning enterprise as an industry. Our school systems are not set things. They're in fact made up of and transformed by the people who are learners within them. And what we have seen over the last couple of years is tremendous ingenuity, tremendous grit, and tremendous innovation. And I'm personally excited for how folks are building from those things. I'm excited to keep telling those stories, and I'm excited for all of us to Tamiko's point, to figure out how to do hard things because we can.
Yeah. And because it's worth it, right? It's totally worth it. I loved it. Tamiko, you talked about your students earning a job. We have to convince them why they should go to school. What's your silver lining? Last 30 seconds.
Just that this is now the final stages of innovation, and it's forced innovation. And it just forces us to rethink how we have solved or tried to solve this problem of how do we educate our current student. And I think they've evolved, and now we got to figure that out. And I think we're behind the 8 ball a bit because we love our old practices, but the time is now, and the excitement in that and how it's changing policy, how we're funding different, how we're looking at it different, just brings a great deal of excitement to me.
What's so interesting as I think about the connections that we can create in a virtual environment. Like we could go on for hours on this conversation. I've got like so much energy inside as a result of this, but we are unfortunately out of time. So first and foremost, I want to say thank you to each of you for your perspective, for your commitment, for your just innovation, willingness, and flexibility, because this work is hard. At the end of the day, it's also worth it. Every single student, you said that one student, if we can change their life, it's totally worth it. And you all are doing that in orders of magnitude. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for contributing to the conversation today. Let's see, if you want a little more information about the high quality virtual learning, you can download the full white paper. The link to it is in the chat. And here at Edmentum, we're here to support and provide quality virtual learning to you and your students. You can use our courses and teachers through EdOptions Academy. It's a fully accredited virtual school with a full catalog of courses. You can also use Edmentum courses with your teachers, or use our instructional services to provide support to level up your teachers if they're not ready for it. We're going to send everybody an email later today with the recording of this event in case you missed it or you want to share it out. We're putting a post-event survey in the chat now, and if you want any more information on these solutions, just put your email address in there and we'll get back with you directly. So next week, we've got another great virtual event in Perspectives. We're talking about supporting the whole learner, which we briefly touched on today. It's Wednesday, October 19th. There's also a link in the chat to register now. So with that, and again, thank you to our panelists, thank you to our audience. This is Jason Mitchell signing off from Edmentum. Thank you and goodbye. Great day. Thanks, y'all.